All right, hello again, class. We begin our look at the next topic, which is project management. We will seek to accomplish the following. We would seek to look at the importance of project management, the idea of project planning, scheduling, and controlling. We will look at the project management techniques, PERT and CPM. Also, we will look at the Gantt chart. We will look at how we will determine the project schedule and what happens when there is variability in the times for each activity. So at the end of the lecture, you should be able to use a Gantt chart to schedule a project, a simple project, draw a project network using the activity on node. So we're not going to use the activity on arrow. So I'm cross out that. You're going to use the activity on node, this one, right? But there's another way to draw the project network, which is the activity on arrow. So people who are in engineering or built environment, they would most likely use the activity on arrow. We will stick to the simpler version of the activity on node. You should also be able to complete the forward and backward passes for a project and determine the critical path for a project. You should also be able to calculate the variance of activity times. All right, now what's a project? Or what are the characteristics of a project? Well, it's usually some single unit of let me rephrase that. Usually a unique undertaking. That's what we call a single unit, meaning that it is not something that you multiply up. It's a unique undertaking that has many related activities. The equipment that you use to work on the project usually are general purpose equipment, and usually the skill set in terms of your labor requirements are high labor skills. You have to pay particular attention to the inventory control because that can be difficult to do. You hear multiple stories of people walking off building sites with barrows filled with all kinds of material and so forth. So when you're undertaking a project, you have a bit of a difficulty with the planning and the inventory control. No. Examples of projects, building construction, you see so many apartments going up and each has its own unique appearance. While there are places to live, they don't quite, have the same outlay and look pretty much the same. Everyone seeks to try to make his or her construction look a little different from the others. And, research, when you're in fourth year, you'd have to do that 4990, whether it's POM or marketing, but you have a research project that is supposed to be unlike something else somebody has ever done. It's supposed to be unique, right? Now, when you're going to manage the projects, you have to exercise the same skills that any manager has to exercise. Planning, scheduling, controlling. We know it as planning, organizing, and controlling, right? But here, the project, when you're going to manage the project, it will require your planning skills, your scheduling skills, your controlling skills. Planning in terms of defining the project, the team of persons who will be on the project, the organization of the project. You must also be able to schedule. What will you be able to schedule? The money, the supplies, the specific activities. Not only that, you'll have to schedule activities that needs to go to another activity. And of course, how people relate to each other. In the controlling of the project, you'll have to monitor the resources that you are using to make the project. You have to look at the costs. You have to pay attention to quality, very important. If you don't, lives could be lost and you'll be in serious trouble. And the budget, always pay attention to the budget. You may have to revise plans and shift resources to meet time and cost constraints of the project. So when you undertake a project, it's serious business. It's not something that you can be playing around with, right? So in particular, the activities that relate to the management of a project, you plan the objective, have to plan the resources, and there is this particular item called the work breakdown structure and how you're going to organize the project. We're going to go back. We're going to pay a particular attention to this idea of the work breakdown structure, this little animal here. When you're scheduling the activities of the project, when does each activity start and end? And you also have to schedule the network. When you're controlling the project, you have to monitor what's going on, compare before and after, revise, take action where necessary. So it's not just about I have to undertake a project or I'm going to do a project and you just jump in. It requires planning. So when you have your projects to do, you know you take love for projects, right? It requires some thought. You don't just get up and say, okay, I'm going to do this. No, you must plan it and you must set it out. What am I supposed to do? How will it be done, etc. Right? Now, a project requires a project manager. It's a lucrative field, but it's a high stress field. It's highly, the project manager is a highly visible part of the project. Now, the project manager is responsible for making sure that all necessary activities are finished in order and on time. The project comes in within budget. That's very important. You cannot be a project manager and on your watch, you're in multiple project overruns. Not going to have much of a reputation in the business. Not only that, you must ensure that the project meets quality goals. And you must ensure that the people that you have on the project, that you have assigned to the different parts of the project, receive the motivation, the direction, and the information that is necessary to enable them to perform. Now, having said that, the project manager should be good coaches. You're not going to be cracking the whip. Well, you should not be cracking the whip over someone's head to get the work done. That is archaic management style. You coach the people. You should not be afraid. While you don't want them to make errors, you're not going to kick them off the project if they make errors. They should learn from that error. So you're going to coach them. You're going to be good communicators, right? And you're going to be able to organize activities from a variety of disciplines. So a project manager has a broad base knowledge of the different areas of study. So if you don't like accounts and you intend to be a project manager, like it now. Operations, finance, you need marketing, you need a little bit of everything to be able to be a good project manager, right? But as I said, it's a lucrative undertaking. And for those of you who can manage the high stress, you can consider it, right? Now, we talk about ethics these days that Whatever you do, and you'll see the university has a thrust towards ethical learning, ethical undertaking, ethical behavior of the students, and not just the students, the constituents of the university. So the project managers face many ethical decisions on a daily basis. Well, like what? Well, oftentimes people give gifts to contractors, for them to do things that they're not supposed to do. So the project manager has to be aware of that and how to handle that. Sometimes the project manager is pressured to alter status of the reports to make it look as though the project is on time when it really is not on time, because time is money, And of course, there's always false reporting about your time and expenses, and then the pressure to compromise quality to meet schedules. So the project manager has to be aware that these are ethical issues that he or she will have to deal with, and must come with a game plan as to how he or she is going to deal with it. Now, we have techniques that we use to schedule projects, right? And these techniques are used to ensure that all activities are planned for, that their order of performance is accounted for, that the activity time estimates are recorded, and that the overall project time is developed. Now, the purposes of project scheduling is to show the relationship of each activity to others and to the whole project. It also is used to identify the precedence relationships among activities. It also encourages the setting of realistic time and cost estimates for each activity. And it helps the project manager to make better use of resources in terms of people, money, material, and by identifying the critical bottlenecks in the project. Now, so we just talk about what the techniques should accomplish, the purposes. We look at the techniques. Why do we employ techniques? For reasons there. We look at the purpose of the scheduling and know what are the techniques that are available to help us achieve those goals there. Well, you have the Gantt chart, right? Now, the Gantt chart is regarded as the father of the networking, Henry Gantt. So the Gantt chart was introduced by this gentleman named Henry Gantt. You would have learned about him in um, Intro to Management. Henry Gantt. And he came up with the Gantt chart. So the principles of the Gantt chart are the same principles that we use to draw the project network. So the critical path method and the project evaluation review technique, we use these to draw networks. Right? So the project management techniques usually really the Gantt chart and networks. The networks are either drawn on the critical path method principle or the project evaluation review technique principle. Now, in order to draw networks or even the Gantt chart, right, we need what is called the work breakdown structure. Let me erase the word right here. So we need what is called the work breakdown structure. And the work breakdown structure takes the project identifies the major tasks in the project, identify the subtask in the major tasks, and the activities or the work packages in the tasks that need to be completed. So this is an example of a work breakdown structure where you are developing, well, the persons were developing the Windows 8 operating system. And you can see the different levels and how they broke down the development of Windows 8 operating system into different levels, right down to work packages. And you can see in terms of its stacked as to what is to come before the other. Now, we said that one of the techniques, the first technique that we use to schedule the project, and when we say schedule the project, we're talking about giving a pictorial of the work breakdown structure, right? It's a simple Gantt chart, all right? A Gantt chart is really a bar chart. So if you look at the bar chart, you'll see that you have the activities. So on the left, it's a description of the activities. So here you have the activities, prototype, test, revise, production. And then at the top, January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, right? We expect that these are the time frames over which we will accomplish the project. And you see that for the design of the project begins somewhere mid-January and runs to mid-June. And so the prototype again begins early March and ends somewhere in late April. So this is a simple Gantt chart. The time is given is just in terms of the months of the year. I really prefer to draw them at the bottom, but they can be drawn at the top also. And so you find that the project begins in mid-January and ends somewhere mid to late September. So this is a simple Gantt chart that it doesn't give very detailed time frames, just that somewhere between in January, February, March, you're going to do stuff, etc. Now, Gantt charts are used in industry still, and they're used in very important places too. So those of you who plan to go off in the summer on your work and study, if you're going to take a Delta when the plane lays over, then the Gantt chart is oftentimes used to display the service activities for the airplane. So if you look at this Gantt chart here, if you look at the bottom portion of the Gantt chart is where I said I prefer the time is set at the bottom. You look here, see the time in minutes. And if you look at the activities, so here you have the activities. Talk about the passengers you're deplaning, the baggage claim, and in terms of how many minutes, you look here, how many minutes it takes you to deplane, to go to baggage claim, and fueling, pumping, how many minutes it takes, etc. So here is fueling. Here, the number of minutes takes about 28 minutes. And you look at all the activities. I just put a vertical line down and the time. So the Gantt chart is still used in areas of our lives that are critical. Service of an airplane. What can be more critical than that, right? So these things are not just taught to you just for the sake of teaching. They're taught to you because when you go out there, you will have to know how to use them in some instances, depending on where you're seeking employment or where you are employed. Now, we do have software that we can use to manage the projects in terms of drawing the schedule of the projects. So these are some of them. You should be able to find Microsoft Project on the systems in the computer labs. And I'm gonna assign you as a self-taught how to use a Microsoft Project, because you do have a component of your work schedule that says you can self-teach. So I'm gonna show you some screenshots, and you can try to see if you're able to use it to help you to draw a project schedule at some point. Okay. All right, now the PERT and the CPM scheduling techniques. See, says your networking techniques. Networks just a series of nodes and arrows that give you a pictorial of the work breakdown structure. They were developed, so they are networking techniques, and they were both developed in the 1950s, almost simultaneously, a year apart. The critical path method, CPM, was by DuPont while they were building some chemical plants. That was in 1957. And the PERT, which is a project evaluation review technique, by Booz Allen and Hamilton, when they were working with the US Navy to build a Polaris missile. Now, both of them, both PERT and CPM, consider precedence relationships and interdependencies. So even though they were developed for different things, we usually call them just PERT CPM. So oftentimes you'll see them written with a dash in between. You'll see them written as PERT/CPM, right? Now, the major difference between the two, however, is that each use a different estimate of activity times. You find that the CPM uses what we call deterministic times. That is, we're pretty sure of what each activity's time will be, while the PERT has variable times. So we'll use probabilistic times for each of the activities. So you find that each activity will have a listing of 3 times, and we'll show you how to utilize those times. No, so irrespective of whether or not you're using PERT or CPM, there are basically six steps to be able to utilize whether the PERT or the CPM. Well, you must define the project and prepare the work breakdown structure. I showed you an example of what it looks like already. You must also develop relationships among the activities. That is, you decide which activities must proceed which and which must follow others, right? Then you draw the network connecting all the activities. After you've drawn the network connecting all the activities, you assign the time and costs estimate to each activity. Here, we're basically interested in assigning the times. We're not going to be using the cost estimates. So just in assigning time to each activity, you become interested in cost estimate when you're going to do something called crashing the project. But we're not going to be crashing the project, so we will just focus on assigning time to each activity. Then you compute the longest time path through the network, And this longest time path is called the critical path. Now, the longest time path is, you must note, is also the shortest time that the project could take to be completed. So the longest time path is also the shortest time that you could take to achieve or to complete the project. Now, and then at step 5, you use the network to help plan, schedule, monitor, and control the project, right? So whether or not you're going to use PERT or you're going to use CPM, you go through those phases. Well, we of course are not going to ask you to come up with those things from scratch. We would have gotten the work breakdown structure and we would give you the work breakdown structure to draw the network. No. So what are some questions that the PERT CPM can answer? Well, then it will have to answer some questions if we're going to take all that time to draw it. So what are some questions? Well, questions that the project manager needs to know. Example, when will the entire project be completed? And how soon will it be completed, really? What are the critical activities or tasks in the project? And critical activities are activities that must be identified because the rise and the fall of the project depends on being able to manage those activities in the appropriate way at the appropriate time. And of course, what are the non-critical activities? You also would like to know what is the probability the project will be completed by a specific date. Other questions are, is the project on schedule, behind schedule, or ahead of schedule? Is the money spent equal to, less than, or greater than the budget? You'd also like to know, or well, the PERT CPM can answer questions such as, are there enough resources available to finish the project on time? And if the project must be finished in a shorter time, what is the way to accomplish this at least cost? Now, when we're going to draw the network for the project called nodes, here the node is something circular. So the project network consists of a series of nodes and arrows. Now the nodes can come drawn as well, that's a rectangle, or the nodes can come drawn as a square, or sometimes it looks long like that. But I tend to use the node that is circular. I find that it is easier for me to draw. But you may see the nodes being drawn as square or rectangles in other places. So the network therefore consists of a series of nodes and arrows. Now we can use these nodes and arrows to draw the network based on either principle of activity on node, AON, or activity on arrow, AOA. The activity on arrow is a little bit more complex. You can see on the right hand side over here where I just put the squiggle, and the activity on node is demonstrated on the left hand side. So you can see that the activity A, which I just circled, is in a node, a circular node. While on the right, let me use a different color ink, using the green ink here, the activity is actually on the arrow, right? And hence it's called activity on arrow. While over here, Where I have the pink tick, the activity is on the node, the circle, right? Now, and it shows you how different activities can be drawn. So it's just an example to show you how we would draw activity on arrow as opposed to activity on node. For the activity on arrow, we have to utilize sometimes what is called a dummy variable, and it can make things a little bit more complicated than we want to have it at this stage of the game. So our focus will usually be with the activity on node, methodology of drawing the network, rather than the activity on arrow. And I'm saying this because I know sometimes you go to as students, you go to YouTube and other places, and they may be using activity on arrow, and you come away more confused than not. So be aware and be careful when you go to look at other sources that you're not looking at the drawing of the network using the activity on arrow method. We are not interested in the activity on arrow method here, or if you're in the School of Engineering or the built environment. In the School of Business, we use the activity on node methodology to draw the network. So that's a caution you must keep in mind, right? Have to remember to erase the board because the markings will carry to the next page, right? Now, we're going to draw a network using the activity on node methodology. So here we have an example of a company called the Milwaukee Paper Manufacturing Activities and Predecessors. So if you notice, give me a second, class. Right, so if you notice here, we have a work breakdown structure in the form of some activities and the description. Now, note that in this table, we have the description of the activity. We're not usually so more interested in the activities, in the description as in the listing of the activity using either letters of the alphabet or numerical values 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So we're interested in activities A to H, and it's good to know what the description of each activity is, but the description is not so much what we're interested in right now as in the listing of the activities and the predecessor relationships of the activities. So activity A, you notice there is a dash under the column immediate predecessor. Likewise with activity B, there is a dash. Well, this dash means that they have no immediate predecessor and that in the drawing of the network, they will come at the beginning of the drawing of the network. That's what that means. Now, do the dashes always appear at the start of the immediate predecessor relationships? No. They can appear anywhere in the listing of the immediate predecessor relationships. It could be at G. If the dash were at G, then it means that G would begin at the start of the project, right? Now, so the dashes mean that the activity across from which the dash appears has no immediate predecessor and that that activity must be begun at the start of the project. So what does A across from C means? So you have here A under the immediate predecessor. I just circled it in green across from activity C. Well, it simply means that you cannot do activity C until you have accomplished activity A, or in other words, A is the immediate predecessor of C. And notice the use of the word immediate predecessor. So we're talking about something that must be immediately done. We're talking about the things, all the things that would have come before. We're talking about immediacy. What must be done now, then. Okay? So it's some students will say, Miss, but if you're going to draw P, what about all the letters that come before P? No, you're talking about just the letter that comes immediately before P. It would be O. We would not be concerned about A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, yada, yada, yada. Just what comes immediately before O for argument's sake, right? So at D, under the immediate predecessor, you see A, B. So what it means is that you cannot start activity D until you have accomplished both activity A and activity B, right? And so you read the immediate predecessors in conjunction with the activity. So activity F, for argument's sake to continue, cannot be accomplished or cannot be drawn until you have done activity C. And for activity H, you cannot accomplish or do activity H until you would have accomplished activity F and activity G. All right, so it's important to understand the immediate predecessor relationships for you to successfully draw and network. I'm always forgetting to erase the board before I turn the page. I'm not erased nor before. So take a picture of the work breakdown structure of the Milwaukee paper manufacturing activities and predecessors, because you're going to need it to follow the drawing of the network. I'm sorry about that, class, but I lost my document, so let me get back to where we were. All right, so here we go. I asked you to take a picture of the Milwaukee paper manufacturing activities and predecessor relationships, work breakdown structure. So here you see, again, so we just go through them that we're interested in the activity. We're interested in the activity, not so much the description and the immediate predecessor relationships, right? So we're going to focus on the activity and the immediate predecessor relationships. So again, I'm going to erase my page and then I'm going to turn the page, all right? So you have your copy of that. So now, to begin the network, notice that we begin with what we call a start node. Here is the start. So we're just going to draw the network. We're not going to be doing any calculator or anything. We're just going to draw the network. We're going to take the work breakdown structure and convert it to pictorial form. So we begin with a start node. Even though when you look at the work breakdown structure, you're looking at the structure, at the description, you see nothing that says start. The point is you must have startup activities. So to begin the drawing of the network, you begin with a node that is labeled start. So our focus is just to be able to convert the table to pictorial form that we call a network. So out of this start node, you will have all those activities that have no immediate predecessor relationship. So when you look back at the table, you will see that activities A and B under the immediate predecessor column across from activity A and B, you will have a dash. So let me go back and show you that. So here, activities A and B under the immediate predecessor relationship, you will see a dash. So that's only for activities A and B, right? For activities A and B, let me emphasize that. For activities A and B, when you look across the immediate predecessor column, you see a dash. It means that those activities must come out of the start node at the beginning of the network, right? So I'm going to go back to the diagram. So here we have those activities, A and B, being drawn out of our start node. So you have your arrows. The arrows are very important. So, and notice we have the head on the arrow to indicate the direction of the precedence relationship. So you're coming from start. You have activity A. So remember I said that when you draw the node, which in this case is a circle, the node says that it is the activity has been begun and it has ended, right? So activity A, build internal components. When you're drawing the network, we don't generally ask you to write on the description, right? But for teaching purposes, we write it here. But when you're drawing it, we don't generally ask you to write on the description. We don't even usually give you the description. We just give you the activities in terms of whether it's letters or numbers we're using, right? So you activity A, which is build an internal components, and activity B, which is modify roof and floor. must come out of the start node. Why must they come out of the start node? Because they have no predecessor relationship. They are activities that you will do at the beginning of the project. They are startup activities, so they will come out of the start node. I must erase the board before I turn the page, right? So then now, having done activity A and B, if you look at your document again, you'll see that across from activity C, you will have activity A under the immediate predecessor column. What that means is that having accomplished activity A, then you can now go on to accomplish activity C. So what we say is that activity A is the immediate predecessor for activity C. And here is activity C, right? You continue on. If you look at your document again, if you look at the work breakdown structure in terms of the table, when you look at activity D and you go across and look at the immediate predecessor listing across from activity D, you will see A, comma, B. What that means is that activity D cannot be accomplished until activity A and B have been accomplished. We therefore say that the immediate predecessors for activity D is activities A and B. So if you notice the drawing of activity D, that you have an arrow coming from A pointing to D, and you also have an arrow coming from B pointing to D, meaning that D requires that both activities A and B have to have been completed immediately before you can begin activity D. So here I've written activities A and B precede activity D. Okay? So think about that while I turn the page, while I erase the page and turn the page. So we're going to continue with the accomplishing of the drawing of the other activities on the network. So having drawn activity D, when you look at activity E across under the immediate predecessor, you will see C. So it means that to draw activity activity E, you will see C. It means to draw activity E. Activity C would have had to be accomplished. So there you see, there is a line going from activity C to activity E. Good. Now, likewise, if you go back to your table across from activity F, you see activity C. So it means another arrow has to come out of activity C. Another arrow has to come out of activity C. There is the purple arrow coming from activity C to activity F. Because if you look at activity F and go across under the immediate predecessor, you will also see C listed across from there. So C is required both for activity F and activity E, meaning you cannot begin activity F or activity E unless you have completed activity C. For activity G, you need D and E to have been completed. So if you look on your network, you see activity G, I've circled it in red, and you see an arrow coming from D going to G, and an arrow coming from E going to G, indicating that G has two immediate predecessors, which are E and D, right? So the arrows show precedence relationships. It's very important that you include your arrows, right? And when you come now to H, the last listed activity, which is inspect and test, you find that for H, you need to have had activities F and G be completed. So activities F, so there is that blue line coming from F, going to H, also from G, going to H. Now, you need one last node, and that is called your finish node. So you have a start node, you have a finish node, right? So the typed one doesn't have it, but notice I've drawn it on. You have a start, you have a finish. You must have if you have a start, you must have a finish, right? And so that is the drawing of the network from our table, work breakdown structure table, that represents the pictorial of the work breakdown structure that we have on the Milwaukee paper manufacturer. Now think about this for a second before I turn the page. So I'm going to be quiet for a moment to give you a second or two to consider what we have just done. All right, so I'm going to erase our page so we can turn to the next matter on our journey here. Now, so having drawn our project network, we are on our way to perform our critical path analysis, right? Now, we had indicated earlier that the critical path is the longest time path through the network. It also indicated to you that the critical path is the shortest time in which the project can be completed. Also note that any delay in any of the critical path activities will delay the projects. Not a question of if or but. It's a question of when. It will cause a delay in the project. Now, I keep saying critical path and critical activities. Well, what are critical activities? Critical activities, and those critical activities make up the critical path, are activities that we say have no slack time. No, well, slack, what is slack? Well, slack really is, so I'm talking about slack. I keep talking about slack. What is slack? Slack here simply means that it is the time that you have to delay the activity. So if you have no slack time, it means mathematically or numerically, the calculated slack will be 0. So critical activities have 0 slack time. So when we say no slack time, mathematically we means that you will come up with a 0 when you calculate that slack time, or a slack time for an activity that comes up with 0. Is that what we mean when we say it has zero slack time. So here is a presentation again of the work breakdown structure in table format. And rather than having our precedence relationship on the right-hand side, we now have times associated with each activity. So here are the times on the right-hand side. I just circled them in blue, and I expect that you're going to take a picture of the times that of this new or the additional information that are here displayed in the work breakdown structure. Now, normally the time and the precedence relationship are given in one table, but for teaching purposes, separating them so you can focus on just the piece that you need at a time. When you get it on your tutorial sheet, the times and the precedence relationships are displayed in the same table. All right, so just note that. All right, so let me erase and then I'm gonna turn. So again, take a picture of your table, and then we will continue on. So I'm just giving you a moment to take a picture of your table. Okay. All right, so here on the work breakdown structure that has the table, that has a time inserted in the table, you'll see that activity A will take 2 weeks or requires 2 weeks to be completed. Activity B, 3 weeks. Activity C, 2 weeks. Activity D, 4 weeks, and so on, up to activity H for a total of 2 weeks. Right, so not for a total of 2 weeks, but activity H will take 2 weeks or should take 2 weeks. Right, so we're going to use those times now to do some additional work on the network. Now, when we're going to work on the network, when we're going to perform what we call a critical path analysis, there are some pieces of information that we need to know to enable us to successfully do our critical path analysis. We need to know and understand the term earliest start time. It's really earliest start time, EST, but of course, you know, we'll have a shortcut. We left off the time, but you must understand that earliest start really mean earliest start time. So you must have an understanding of the concept of earliest start time. And the earliest start time is the time at which an activity can start, assuming all predecessors have been completed. And we learned earlier what a predecessor was, that it was those activities or that activity that must be completed immediately before you begin another activity, right? So the companion to the earliest start time is the earliest finish time. And it is the earliest time at which an activity can be completed. Then you have another set called the latest start time or late start time or latest start. And either of those names are good enough. And it is the latest time at which an activity can start so as to not delay the completion time of the entire project. And the companion for the late start is the late finish. And the late finish time for an activity is the latest time by which an activity has to be finished so as to not delay the completion time of the entire project. So they come in pairs. They're Bobbsey twins. When you talk about earliest start time or early start time, you must think about earliest finish time also. And when you think or talk about late start or latest start time, you must also be thinking about the latest finish time. So these are principles that you need to have cemented in your mind before you can do a successful critical path analysis. So I'm giving you a second to take a picture And then we will turn the page and we will seek to do some work with that, right? Now, we looked at the drawing of the network, just the drawing of the network. We did not seek to do any calculations. We just learned how to draw the network using the precedence relationship. But when we're going to now do the critical path analysis, we're going to have to be able to do a little bit of calculations, just your basic addition and subtraction. We will have to do what we call passes through the network. We will have to do one, a forward pass, and two, a backward pass. So note, we have to do a forward pass and a backward pass. On our forward pass, we will determine our earliest start times and our earliest finish time. So again, on the forward pass, we determine our earliest start time and the earliest finish time. Those are the only two finishes we can do on the forward pass. On the backward pass, so on our backward pass, we determine our latest start and our latest finish. So again, we make two passes through the network, a forward pass. On the forward pass, we determine our earliest starts and our earliest finish. The second pass is the backward pass. What do we determine on the backward pass? Our latest start and our latest finish. Now, in the node, remember I say that the node can also be drawn as a square or a rectangle. I use the circle. So if you prefer to use the square or the rectangle, that is fine. What must happen though is that you must be consistent in the display of the information in the node. You cannot write it willy-nilly. I would suggest that you use a legend to indicate what it is that you're displaying in the node if you're not using the circle. However, I will use the circle, and the information therefore in the circle will be displayed as follows on the board. So in the top right hand of the, or let me say top left hand, let me begin with the top left hand. In the top left hand of the node, you will find your early start. Call it ES. In the top right hand of the node, you will find your early finish. In the bottom left hand of the node, you will find your late start. And in the bottom right hand, you will find your late finish. In the center of the node, in the center top, you will find the activity name or symbol or however we have designated that activity. And in the bottom center, you will find the duration of the activity. So you draw the circle, you divide it with two vertical lines, equidistant. Then you divide those two pieces into quarters. So you have 4 quarters, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the blank space in the middle, right? Now, so again, let me give you a second to look at the construct of the node. in terms of how we display the information in the node. So if you're going to use a square, the information is usually displayed in a similar manner. So you do not have poetic license or artistic license to display the late finish in the top left or move the late start in the top right. The information is pretty much displayed just as is here in the particular order. So you cannot have the late start and late finish at the top and the early start and early finish at the bottom. No. Whether you use the circle, the square, the rectangle, you must have the earlies, that is the early start and the early finish in the top section of the diagram, and the lates, that is the late starts and the late finish, in the bottom section of the diagram. Okay, so a word to the wise. All right. So each of the nodes then that we drew in the network must be compartmentalized like this. So again, whether you're using the circle or the square or the rectangle, it must be compartmentalized like this. Remember that we had only focused on being able to draw the network. Now we're going to focus on being able to do a forward pass and a backward pass, meaning we're doing a critical path analysis of the network, right? So I'm going to turn the page. Now, before we begin, though, to actually make the forward pass, we must have a knowledge of the rules, right? Now, for the forward pass, we're going to begin at the start event, and then we're going to work our way from left to right in the network, right? So for the earliest start time rule, note if an activity, so go with our rule. If an activity has only a single immediate predecessor, its early start is equal to the early finish of the predecessor. So what that means is suppose activity B has only activity A as its immediate predecessor. It simply means that the early finish of activity A becomes the early start of activity B. That is what that means, right? So it says if an activity has only a single immediate predecessor, for example, if activity B has only activity A as its immediate predecessor, its early start, meaning activity B, early start equals the early finish of the predecessor, where the predecessor would be, for example, activity A. Now, what if the activity has multiple immediate predecessor? So suppose this is activity C. And activity C has activities A and activities B as its immediate predecessor, right? So we're looking at point 2. It says if an activity has multiple immediate predecessors, for example, if an activity like C has, say for argument's sake, 2, A and B, immediate predecessors, its early start, that is an activity such as C, early start is the maximum of all the early finish values of its immediate predecessor. Lots of words, but it's a simple construct, right? So here is activity C. Activity A as an early finish, activity B as an early finish. So suppose the early finish for activity A was 3 and the early finish for activity B was 6. According to rule 2, it says where you have multiple, in this case, multiple is just 2, but it could be more than 2. If it has multiple immediate predecessors, so activity C has multiple, in this case, A and B predecessors, C's early start will be the maximum of the early finish values. So since C is looking for an early start for C, you look at the immediate predecessors for C, which in this case A and B. The early finish for A is 3. The early finish for B is 6. The rule says it has to be the maximum. Therefore, the early start for C has to be the 6 because it's the maximum, right? So that's what rule 2 is saying, that if an activity has multiple immediate predecessors, its early start is the maximum of all the early finish values of its immediate predecessors. So that's what that means, right? So think about that for a second. So at the bottom here, we're simply repeating it. That's all that's going on at the bottom. We're simply repeating it here, where we say the early start of an activity is equal to the maximum, where we open the curly brackets, of the early finish of all immediate predecessors. So to begin the forward pass, you must have a knowledge of that in your mind. All right? So I'm giving you a second to look at it, think about it before I flip the page. Now, remember I said that when you think about the early start, your next thought should be, so what about the early finish? So here's the rule for the early finish. The earliest finish time, EF or EFT, of an activity is the sum of its early start time and its activity time. So all that means is that an activity, let me just draw something right here. So you have an activity, call it activity A. Suppose the activity's duration is 3 weeks. The early start time is 6, begins at week 6. So you know the early start, 6. You must know, figure out the early finish. What it is saying is that the early finish, that's where the question sign is, of that activity would be the early start time, the 6, plus the activity time, the 3, and that would equal 9, right? So again, the rule says the early finish time of an activity is the early start time of the activity plus the activity time, right? So let me give you a second to think about that before I move on to the next page. Now again, it's just another view of the node, but this time beginning at the start node. The start node will have as its early start 0 time. So for every network in that network, the early start will always be 0. The duration will always be 0. And therefore, the early finish, which is the early start of the activity, plus the duration of the activity will always be 0. So again, the early start of the activity will be 0. The duration will be 0. The early finish, therefore, will be the early start, which is 0, plus the duration, which is 0. That will give you the early finish, which is 0. So in the start node, your early start and your early finish and your duration will always be 0. Now remember, it is on the forward pass that you will always be thinking about early start and early finish. Good? Now, for the Milwaukee paper, after we had done our network, let me go back and show you what the network looked like. So there is the network. We had just drawn the network. We're now going to have to do the critical path analysis through the network. So just a refresher of what the network looked like. This is just the drawing of the network. What is the calculations in terms of the early start, early finish, late start, late finish look like? In other words, we're trying to accomplish a critical path analysis of the network. We are going to have to add some more information to the nodes. So we're going to have to add some more information to the nodes. In that, we're going to have to redraw our nodes to display the activity name up here, the activity time down here, the early start over there, the early finish over there, the late start over there, and the late finish over there. So we have to modify each node to be able to display that information. So this is just a reminder of what the network looks like. And we constructed the network from the table that we call the work breakdown structure. So I'm going to go back to the part of the network where we're going to be calculating the early start and the early finish. This is just a reminder that this is how we drew the network, but we will have to calculate some information in the network for the network to be of more use to the project manager. All right. Now, when you have gotten the hang of it, yes, you can draw the network and put in the information in one fell swoop. But until you become experts, teaching purposes, you have to separate it like this so that each part sticks in the brain or you understand it a little better. So out of the start node, we would have had activity A, right? According to the additional information, activity A will take 2 weeks, right? So the start node being at the beginning there. Now remember that out of the start node, we have activities, both activity A and activity B, right? our start node will have both activity A and activity B coming out of it. But I'm isolating them so that you can see clearly what we're doing with each activity. So coming from the start node, we will have activity A. So I'm just going to put a So coming from the start node, we would have our activity A, right? So you're going to have that. And notice the early finish from the start node becomes the early start of activity A. When we add the duration of activity A, we will get the early finish of activity A, right? And so that is how you would have your information display in your early start and your early finish of the activity, right? Now, I'm going to turn the page to go to activity B, right? So that's one of the activities. The next activity that would come out of the start node would be activity B. Remember, we have drawn our network already, so I'm just isolating the parts so that you're able to see clearly. So out of the start node, you will also have your activity B. Notice because activity B has as its immediate predecessor the start node, then the early finish of the start node will become the early start of activity B. And so the addition of the early start of activity B, which is 0, plus the activity time will give us the early finish of activity B. Right, again, the early finish of the start node, which is 0, will become the early finish, the early start, sorry, of activity B. When you take the early start of activity B and add it to the duration of activity B, you will get the early finish of activity B, right? Now, why the 0 as the early start for activity B? Because this 0 is the early finish of the immediate predecessor for B, and the immediate predecessor for B is the start node, okay? Right, so consider that for a second. Now, if you look at, so we're continuing with our diagram drawing. If you look at, go back and look at your initial drawing of the network, you will find that the immediate predecessor for C is activity A, right? The immediate predecessor for C is activity A. So here you'll find that the early start time for activity C is which is 2, is the early finish time for activity A. And when you add the early start time of activity C, which is 2, to the duration of C, which is also 2, the early finish time for activity C is 4. So I'm pausing to give you a moment to look about it, right? Now, for activity D has two immediate predecessor. That is activity A and activity B, right? Now, so let me draw in an arrow here to help you with that. So again, activity D has as its immediate predecessor activities A and activity B. Now remember we said that when an activity such as D has multiple immediate predecessors such as A and B, the early start of that activity such as D is the maximum of the early finish values of those immediate predecessors. So activity D has activity A as one of its immediate predecessor, where the early finish for A is 2 and the other immediate predecessor is B, where the early finish is 3. So the rule says out of the 2 and the 3, we must take the maximum, and that maximum is 3. Hence, the early start for activity D is 3. So I'm giving you a second to think about that. I'm going to erase the page and then I'm going to turn the page. So what you have is the information now in D because we took the maximum of the early finish of A and B. So we compared 2, 3. We took the maximum of 3. And when we add 3 and 4, so that's the early start of 3 and the duration of 4, we got the early finish of 7. So again, let me repeat that. When we took the early start of 3 activity D plus the duration of 4, add them together, we got 7. So the early finish for activity D would be in the 7th week. And so we continue our march through the network. So for activity E, the early start time of C would form the early finish time for E. The early start time of 4 from C would also form the early finish time of 4 for F. For G, we would be comparing the early finish time of 8 from E, the early finish time of 7 from D, and because the rule says the maximum, we will take 8 as the early start time for G, because G's immediate predecessors would be E and D, right? When you come to H, H has two immediate predecessors. There is F with its early finish time of 7, and there is G with its early finish time of 13. Hence, early finish time of 13 from G gets to be the early start time of H because 13 is greater than 7. And so H's early start time would be the maximum of the early finish time of its immediate predecessor, meaning we look at F, which has an early finish of 7, and G, which has an early finish of 13, and we took the maximum, which is 13. When we add the 13 to the 2, we get the 15. Therefore, in the finish node, we would have 15. So you would have a start and you will have a finish node. In the finish node, you will have 15. Okay, so you have a start node, you must have a finish node. I want no project that has no start node and has no finish node. You must have a start and you must have a finish. Good. So that is the completed early finish. So we have completed the early pass through the network from start to finish. Within the finish, we would have, oopsie, I didn't erase that. So in the finish, we would have 15 weeks, right? So when I draw on the board, I'm going to have to erase it to go around, but you must have that finish node with the completed time, the earliest finish time, the last early finish time on the project. But I'm going to have to erase it so that I can turn the page, but you mustn't erase yours, right? No. So having completed the forward pass, we will now begin our backward pass. Now, to begin with the backward pass, so on the forward, you can only do the early start and the early finish. But you notice there are 4 slots and we only completed 2. So we have to complete the bottom 2. And the bottom 2 slots, as we see, is where we would put our lates. The late start and the late finish. So on the backward pass, we must do our calculations for the lates. Late start, late finish. Now, we're going to begin with the last event. So the last event was the finish node. The last event was the finish node. Now, what is our latest finish rule? So remember, let me draw. I'll just give you a visual so that you can focus on it in the meantime. Remember, our nodes would look like this. So you have our finish node, and you have the nodes going into the finish node. Good, you had 15 here. You have 13 here. You had 2. And you would have 15 here. Good. So notice the bottom half of our nodes are empty. There, where I'm putting the green question sign. Now, when you have your finish node, right? The figure that is in the finish node is where you're going to begin your backward pass from and with. So you begin your backward pass from the finish node, and you're going to pick up the information that is in the finish node to start your journey of your backward pass. Now, the latest finish rule therefore says, if an activity is an immediate predecessor for just a single activity, its latest finish rule equals the late start of the activity that immediately follows it. And if an activity is an immediate predecessor to more than one activity, its late finish is the minimum of all late start values of all activities that immediately follow it. So the late finish of an activity is the minimum of the late starts of all immediate following activities. It's easier said, it's easier done than said. So let's demonstrate. Beginning with to begin your backward pass, you pick up the information that is in your finish node. Since the finish node here is the node that is your immediate predecessor for this activity that comes in front of it, you're going to pick up the 15, you're going to walk backwards, and you're going to go to the late finish spot that is immediately next to it. So you take the 15 from the finish, you go backwards, so you're following the forward arrows in a backward way. You go backwards and you plunk it down in the late finish spot, right? If you had other nodes that terminated in the finish node, you will also take the information from the finish node to those other nodes also. In this instance, there is only one node that came into the finish node, so the information in the finish node will only go to one late finish slot on the backward pass. So this 15 in the finish node will form your first late finish. And that is how you open the loop to begin the backward pass. So it's imperative that you have a finish node with the information in it, because that is where you're going to get the information from to begin your backward pass. Now remember, if you had more than one nodes going into the finish node, that information in the finish node will also be taken to those other nodes that came into the finish node, and that information from the finish node would go into those other late finish slots. All right? So let me pause so you can think about that. All right, now that you have a moment to think about that, let me turn the page. No, the late start. So we know how to find the late finish of an activity. How do we find the late start of an activity? Well, the late start time is simply the late finish time minus the activity time, right? So the late start of an activity is simply the late finish minus the start, right? How do I get my first late finish? You get your first late finish to begin your backward pass by picking up the information that is in your finish node, and you travel backwards on the arrows to all the arrows that came into the finish node, and those late finish slots, you plunk down the information that you took up from the finish node into the late finish slots of all those arrows that came into the late finish. Sorry, came into the finish node. If it is only one arrow that came into the finish node, you take the information from the finish node and walk back on that one arrow, and you place the information into that late finish node. If multiple arrows came into the finish node, you take the information from the finish node and plunk it into all those slots or dashes or arrows that you walk backward on, going backward into the network, right? Now, so let me redraw my finish. As I said, I didn't put it on. It didn't come on this, but it must be there. The finish node must be there. So let me draw it for emphasis here. So you have your finish node. And you have your 15 weeks here. Good. So you take this 15 from the finish node, this 15 from the finish node. You walk backwards, so you're following the arrows, and that's why it's important to put the arrowheads on the arrows so you know where you're going. Because if not, you're going to be wondering, where did this come from again, or who was supposed to have this? So the arrows tells you the precedence relationship, meaning what comes before what and what comes after what. So you take the 15. So imagine that you're a little man, you're a little green man from Mars, right? There you are. You go to the finish node, you pick up the 15, and there you are coming back with it. And so you're walking on the arrow, and there you are, you plunk it in the late finish slot of the node that came into the finish node. So there is that late finish. So you're opened up the backward pass, right? And that is how you open your backward pass. If you had multiple other nodes that finish in the or terminate in the finish slot, you would also put that 15 into their late finish slot. But in this case, only one node terminated into the finish slot, all right? So you have now how to begin your backward pass because you have the first entry, which is your late finish. Now your late finish, which is the 15 circling green. So it's the one that is not the 15 at the top, the 15 at the bottom. You take that 15, you subtract, change the color. So you subtract the 2, and hence you get the late start of 13. So when we say the late start is equal the late finish minus the activity time, that's what we mean. The 15 that I just circled in, it was circled in green and I over circled it with the pink, minus the 2, which is the activity time of H, gives you the late start. That is the one that is circled in pink, right? The 13 that I put a tick against, that is your early start. The 13 that I have circled in the pink, that is your late start. So there are two 13s there, but one means your early start and one means your late start. The late start, that is the one that I've circled in pink, is calculated on the backward pass, right? So think about that for a minute. Again, I have to erase the board before I can make a turn. Otherwise, they're going to go with me to the next page. All right. So remember, you must have your finish node. I erase it, but you're not to erase yours. Your finish node must be there. So here we have, let me put back on my finish node. So as I said, I don't want anybody giving me a diagram without a finish node and say, oh, but Miss, you never had it on the thing. So here it is, your finish node. And it has the 15 weeks. Yeah, that's weeks I just write, right? So now, so you have completed H. You have the late finish. You subtracted the 2. You got the 13. Now this 13 from H is now going to become the late finish for activity F. Why? Because notice there's an arrow that came in from F to H. So you're going to pick up that late start of 13, and you're going to backtrack on that arrow and plonk that 13 down in the late finish spot for F. All right, let me go to the next page so you can see it a bit more complete without the diagram across the middle. So again, I have to erase so I can go forward. So here, let me use this one to give you some more context. So here the 13, that was the late finish for H, becomes, sorry, that was the late start for H, becomes the late finish for F. Why? Because there's an arrow that came from F to H. So remember, you're walking backwards, so you're backtracking on the arrows, right? So you backtracked on the arrow from H to F. So you backtrack on the arrow that came in from F to H. You're going backwards now from H to F. And you're carrying the 13 with you. Now, likewise, an arrow also came from G to H. So when you pick up this 13, which is the late start, you must also backtrack on the arrow that came in from G to H. So you're backtracking now from H to G, and you're carrying that late start to G to become the late finish for G. Remember, you would have begun with your finish node. You pick up the information that is in the finished node. You backtrack on that arrow. You come to the late finish for H. You subtract the activity time from the late finish, 15 minus 2. That's how you get that 13. What do I now do with that 13, which becomes my late start? Well, you look for the arrows that came into that node of H, and you're going to walk backwards on those arrows. So just as how the arrows came in, you're going to walk backwards on those arrows, right? Good. So now we have dealt with the backward pass in terms of the late finish for both F and G. Now, at F, the late finish is 13. Therefore, 13 minus 3 will give you 10, which will make the late start for F 10. Good? Now you go to G. The late start was 13. 13 minus 5 gives you 8. Good? So then, if you look at G, you would see that 2 arrows came into G, one from D and one from E. So for G or from G, you'll pick up that 8, which is the late start. So notice I circle the late start in pink in G. You take up that 8, which is the late start from G, and you will backtrack to E. And that late start from G to E, which is the 8, will become the late finish for E. Now, so the late finish for E of 8 minus the activity time of 4 gives you the late start of 4 for E. Now, we have to consider C. C had an arrow coming from C to F and one arrow coming from C to E. So it means on the backward pass, we're going to have to consider an arrow coming from F to C and an arrow coming from E to C. So we're backtracking on the arrows. Just so we consider them going forward, we have to consider them going backward. So from F, the late start is 10. But from E, the late start is 4. And remember, when there's a competition for a late finish from among the late starts of its immediate following predecessors, you have to take the minimum. So here, the late start from F is 10. The late start from E is 4. So 10 and 4 are in competition to form the late finish for C. The rule says we have to take the smaller of the two, or the smallest of however many. So between 4 and 10, the smallest is 4. So the late finish for C becomes the minimum of 4 and not the 10. So hence for C, the late finish becomes the minimum of the late start of its immediate following predecessors. So 4 being the late finish for C, you will subtract the activity time of 2, and hence you get the late start that I circled in pink of 2. Good. Now, so we go back and we consider. So notice we did H, F, G, E, and C, but we still have D, B, A, and the start node to complete. So we continue with our backwards trek, right? So when you come to D now, the arrow from D to G means we must now consider a trek from G to D. So here's the arrow from D going to G. We must now consider the backward trek from G to D. So you pick up the late start, the 8 that I'm circling, and you march all the way over to D, and you plunk that down in the late finish section of D. 8 minus 4 gives you the late start of 4, right? Now, you can do activities B. So from activity D, you have an arrow that came in from B to D, from boy to dog. So it means though you have to consider a backward arrow from dog to boy. So you pick up this 4 from dog, you run over to boy, that is from D to B, and you place that 4 right there in the late finish slot. 4 minus 3 is 1. Now, you're going to look from dog now to apple, D to A. But when you're looking from D to A, notice that you also have to consider an arrow from C to A. Why? Because an arrow left from A to C, even as it left from A to D. So on the backward pass, you must consider those arrows too. So from C to A, you're going to be considering the late start of 2. And from D to A, you're going to be considering the late start of 4. But it says you must take the minimum. And so when you consider 2 or 4, 2 is the minimum. So you must take 2. 2 minus 2 gives you 0. So when you're going to the start, notice there is an arrow from start to A and an arrow from start to B. So you must consider then a start, an arrow from B to start and an arrow from A to start. When you look at the A node, you see the late finish. Late start is 0. When you look at B, the late start is 1. So here you're considering 0 or you're considering 1. When you consider 0 and 1, the minimum is 0. So here gets 0, 0 minus 0, you get 0. And hence in the start node, all your entries will be zeros. And so that's what your backward pass looks like. So I'm going to erase all of that and go to the next slide. All right. Remember, I have to erase so that they don't travel with me to the next slide. And so here is a complete look. So I must finish this by drawing in my finish node. So I have my finish with my 15, right? Because that's where it really should end. Finish with my 15 in it, okay? And so this is a complete look. Well, let me rephrase that. This is a look at the completed backward and forward pass. So now that we have completed the backward and the forward pass, our task is to figure out what is our critical path or the critical activities that make up the critical path. How do we do that? We need to calculate the slack in each of the activity. Now, I'm going to turn to the next page. I may have to come back, but I'm going to turn to the next page, which means again, I'm going to have to erase my finish node so it doesn't travel with me. Ouch. All right. So erase it just so that it doesn't travel with me, which remember, you must not erase yours. So let me say that again. All right. So we're going to have to calculate the slack time for each activity. Yes, it seems long, but when you get the hang of it, it's pretty short and nifty. You can just do it with a click of your finger. All right, so now the slack. Now slack is the length of time that you can delay an activity for without delaying the entire project, right? It's the length of time that you can delay an activity for without delaying the entire project. Now notice you can use either a pair of late start minus the early start or late finish minus the early finish, right? So let me just give you the visual. Remember, here is your early start. Here is your late start. Here is your early finish. And there's your late finish. So you can use either that pair or this pair, right? Here, late start minus, sorry, late finish minus late start. If you do it the other way around, if you take late start minus late finish, you're going to get negative values, and that's wrong, right? You must not be getting any negative values. So that's a late start minus early start, or late start minus early start, or late finish minus early finish, right? So it's either the late start minus the early start or late finish minus the early finish. If your friend is using the late start minus the early start and you're using the late finish minus the early finish, you must get the same response. If you're getting different responses, there is an error there, right? So whichever pair you use, you must get the same response, okay? All right, now, any activity in which you make the calculation of either the late start minus the early start or the late finish minus the early finish, and you get a 0, that activity is called a critical activity, right? Now, on the critical path, you will have a set of activities that will have only 0 slack. So the critical path, which is the longest time path through the network, is comprised or composed only of activities that have 0 slack. Now they must be listed in their natural occurring order. You cannot jump over them and you cannot jumble them up. It's a pathway, one after the other, right? No, it starts at the first activity in the project and terminates at the last activity in the project. That is the critical path, right? Only activities that have 0 slack, beginning at the beginning of the project or the start of the project, ending at the last activity in the project. And remember, the critical path includes only critical activities, and critical activities are activities that have 0 slack. So we're going to calculate the critical activities for each of our node. All right, so let's get the show on the road. So for the start node, the late start minus the early start, 0 minus 0, or the late finish minus the early finish, 0 minus 0, the slack is 0. For activity A, the late start of 0 minus the early start is 0. 2, late finish minus early finish minus 2, that slack is 0. For B, it is 1 minus 0, which is 1, or 4 minus 3, which is 1. For C, it is 2 minus 2 or 4 minus 4. Either way, the result is 0. For D, it is 4 minus 3 or 8 minus 7. Either way, the result is 1. For E, it is 4 minus 4 or 8 minus 8. Either way, the slack is 0. And for G, it is this 8, the late start, minus the early start, 8 minus 8, which is 0, or the late finish of 13 minus the early finish of 13. Either way, that's 0. For F, it is 10 minus 4, 13 minus 7. Either way, the result is 6, a slack of 6 days. And for H, the slack is 0 days. So I'm gonna turn my page. Again, I'm gonna have to use, right? It was not a wise thing. So I'm gonna have to erase, but I've calculated the slack. The next slide will show you them displayed. So here is your slack. You write them at the top, you can write them at the bottom, right? So if you write them at the top, it's probably clearer because you'll know for sure which is what, right? So here you have the slack being displayed for each of the activity, right? So our critical path, so Our critical path the start, so the critical path rather than part. Start has a 0 slack. Your next activity that has a 0 slack is activity A. The next activity that has 0 slack is activity C. The next one that has a 0 slack is activity E. Next one is activity G. And the next one is activity H. And you arrive at your finish. So your critical path start A to C to E to G to H, and your finish. From start to finish. Notice the arrows is just a highlight to show you where you begin. So from start through to activity A, through to activity C, down through activity E, onto activity G, onto activity H. No, you can't tell me that the critical path is A, E, C, H, G. No, must be listed in the naturally occurring order. And you must have a critical activity at the beginning of the network. Otherwise, how are you going to get into the middle of the network, right? So if you cannot find a critical activity at the start of the network, it means you have made an error. You must go back and check again. One, if you have multiple activities coming out of your start node, one of them must be a critical activity, right? And if you're finding a gap in the listing of your critical activities, there's also an error. So suppose you go from start to A, and then your next critical activity is G or E, then there's an error because you have not walked a natural pathway. Some jump has occurred. So it's not a high jump or a long jump. It is a natural walking along a path. Okay, so remember that. So those things you must look out for. Sorry about that. So your critical path, start A, C, E, G, H, finish. I know some places do not list the start, but I'm going to ask you, the start of your exam, is it detrimental? Is it rather material to your examination timing? It is. So the time that you have designated to begin a project is of critical importance. The time that you're supposed to be at the airport to catch your airplane, is it material to you being on the flight? It better be, otherwise you're gonna have to buy a new ticket. So please, nobody to tell me that start is not included in the critical listing. It is. All right. Okay. So I erase again so that we can turn the next page. All right. So we use the slack time to determine the critical activities, but we also use the slack time to write up what we call the project schedule, right? So notice the project schedule or the schedule is a table. It's written in table format. Notice the heading of the table, right? Notice the heading of the table. The heading of the table talks about the activity name, the early start time of the activity, the early finish time, the late start of the activity, the late finish time, the slack, and then you ask the question, is this activity on the critical path? Yes or no? Is it on the critical path? So the activity schedule has 7 headings. It's a table that comes with headings, 7 headings. So you can be asked for the schedule of the entire project or for the project. It means you must list all the activities and the relevant information. Where are you going to get that information? Why? On the node of the um the the network. So for example, if you look at activity A, you on the network, you'll see that the start time is 0, the early start time is 0, the early finish time is 2, the late start time is 0, the latest finish time is 2, the late slack time, well, the slack time is 0. And is it on the critical path? Yes or no? Yes, you answer that question. For activity B, you pick up the early start, the early finish, late start, late finish, the slack, and the question. Is it on the critical path? Yes or no? No. Now, I don't want to see any empty spaces. What are you writing in there? What does that empty space mean? Students have this habit of not answering the no if it is not a part of the critical pathway. Please don't do that. You must answer the question, yes or no. It is either yes or no. Write it in the table. Please notice you don't see any blank spaces under the 7th heading, which is it on the critical path? Yes or no. If you leave it blank, I'm going to think you don't know what you're doing. Right? So sometimes you're asked for the project schedule, or you can be asked for simply one of the activities. If it's just for one of the activities, you must still have the 7 headings and still answer all the pieces in the heading, right? I think that's clear enough. All right, so this is just to highlight that some of the information would be yes, some would be no, and the ones that have 0 slack, you know that an activity that has 0 slack, those activities are critical activities, right? But notice that all of the pieces of the information are answered or included. So I don't want any empty slots on the table. All right. Answer the question. All right. So this is a Gantt chart of the same project that we're doing, that we did using the network. So the Gantt chart, you list the activities. Well, in this one, you can list the description, but we're not so much interested in the description here as we are in the listing of the activities, right? So the activities. So you begin at the top. Notice you begin at the top, listing of doing the Gantt chart, right? So the first activity takes what, 2 weeks. And so you count forward until you get to the 15th week. So notice the precedence relationships are observed in the drawing of the Gantt chart, right? So activity, for example, activity C begins where activity A ends, right? So notice activity A and activity B they begin on, this is really the zero line, right? Your start, this first line would be your equivalent to your start node. They begin flush on the start node, right? The zero line. So they runs 1, 2 weeks, right? And so activity D will begin where activity B ends. So here is activity D beginning where activity B ends. And you'll have activity E beginning where activity C ends. So the same precedence relationship reasoning is used in the Gantt chart as you would in the network, because remember I said the Gantt chart is is regarded as the father of the network, right? So I'm going to show you the backward pass, but we're generally only asking you at this stage about the forward pass. So no one should say they don't know how to do a Gantt chart when I ask you to do a Gantt chart, because the similar reasoning in terms of the precedence relationship works. So I'm going to give you a moment to consider that. So if you look back at your network, and look back at the precedence relationship, you can see them clearly listed here, right? So as I said, you have the activities such as A and B that would begin at the 0 bar. So just like in your network, any activity that has no precedence relationship must begin at the start node. The first bar that I labeled the 0 bar, that is your start node on the Gantt chart. And you follow the precedence relationship just as you would in the network. Okay? No, so that's your forward pass. Notice project ending at week 15. So we do not normally ask you for the backward pass on the Gantt chart. It can be done as I'm showing you here. It takes a little more time and effort, but it can be done. You can see to help yourself if you wish to unravel the backward pass, right? But for all intents and purposes, we will ask you about the forward pass network, right? When we do the Gantt chart, we're really only just asking to do the forward pass, okay? But for those who are intrepid and like a challenge, you can try to unravel the backward pass, okay? All right, now we still have some more to go. That the network can be drawn along the CPM PERT principle, either using activity on arrow or activity on node. We have settled on the activity on node. Now, we'd also initially note that the distinction between the CPM and the PERT is in the assumption about the times that you ascribe to each activity. Now, again, just a reminder that in the critical path method, we assume we know the time estimate for each activity. And generally, we don't think that those times will vary. So they're fairly fixed in our minds, right? For example, you know pretty much how much time it takes for you to move from point A to point B, barring any unfortunate or any unusual circumstances. You know that it take you half an hour to get from point A to point B, and that's pretty much standard, right? Unless something intervenes. So when we're pretty sure of the time, they kind of remain fixed. Um, we call that a deterministic time. But oftentimes in life, life doesn't work like that. You plan something and you think that you know that this is what it's going to be, but things happen and the time changes. It can go up, it can go down, it can remain between the up and the down, right? So you have variability in the times that activities can take. To be more precise, we say that if the project is something that is um un well, all projects are unique, but this is something that you have no precedence to go from. So when they were building the Polaris missile, they have never built a missile before. So they had nothing from which to go on to build the missile. Hence, they had to say the times can vary. Unlike they were building a tank to hold chemicals. They had built tanks, many tanks to hold chemicals, so they were pretty much sure how much time would be needed to construct each part of such an undertaking. So we have, therefore, when we have variability in the times, we use a probability distribution for the activity times to allow for such a variability, right? Now, so you find that when we have variability in the time, that is, we're talking about the PERT, we have 3 time estimates are required, therefore, for each activity. So unlike the critical path where you would find that each activity only has 1 time allotted to it, when we're dealing with a PERT setup, a project evaluation review technique setup, you'll find that each activity will be ascribed or given 3 times. Then you're going to ask, so Miss, which time I use on the network? Good question. We're going to come to that, all right? So just keep your eyes peeled. So the 3 time estimates that you will find for each activity, one is called an optimistic time, and you know how we like a shortcut. We call the optimistic time A. And the optimistic time is if everything goes according to plan. The pessimistic time, which of course we call B because we love a shortcut again, we assume that conditions are unfavorable, doesn't go according to plan, in other words. And then we have the most likely time, which we call M, and that is a most realistic estimate. Usually the most likely time falls in between the optimistic, which is at one end, and the pessimistic, which is at the other end. So note the shortcut letters, A for optimistic, B for pessimistic, and M for most likely, because you know how we love a short form, right? So now we say that the estimate follows the beta distribution. We normally talk about normal distribution, but in project management, the statistical distribution that proxies the time variations are called the beta distribution, but we are going to find that the beta distribution look very much like the normal distribution. So we end up using the information from the normal distribution, right? Just a little bit of statistics and just a little bit of knowing that that is what. So you don't have to worry yourself too much there. All right, so then I had asked earlier, so since each activity is going to have 3 different times allotted to it, what then am I going to do when I'm drawing the network? Well, you will draw the network, follow the precedence relationship, just as you would when you drew this critical path method. That is the example we just finished. Nothing different in drawing the network. You simply follow the precedence relationship. But to find the time to display on the chart for each activity, when I say chart, I mean the network, you're going to have to do a little bit of calculation, right? A little bit of fancy footwork, I call it, using this formula here. So you're going to calculate the expected time. What are you going to do with the expected time? You're going to use it as the activity time, right? So when you get the information where the table has the breakdown of the activities, precedence relationship, and you see each activity has an optimistic time, a pessimistic time, a most likely time, you're going to use the formula, the expected activity time T is equal to A, the optimistic times, plus 4 times the most likely time, plus the pessimistic time, and everything divided by 6. Don't meddle with the 4 and the 6, please. They come with the formula. So all you do is to substitute the values for A, for M, and for B, twiddle them around in your calculator, and then divide it by 6. We'll talk about the variance in a little bit, right? So the expected time for an activity must be calculated using this little animal that is called the expected activity time formula, where expected activity time is equal to A plus 4M plus B all divided by 6. You know, I'm going to have to erase my markings to turn over again. We'll come back to this little animal called the variance, all right? Just going to come focus on the expected activity time for the time being. All right, so we can skip over that. So here is the Milwaukee paper project. Suppose the project manager suddenly realized that, well, you know, this project that I'm undertaking, I don't have anything that I can look at as a guide. It's so new that there's nothing I can say that what might be the time. So I'm going to be realistic and give it some optimistic, pessimistic, and most likely. Notice now that each activity has the 3-time activity A. Remember, it only had the most likely time 2 weeks. Now it has an additional time of 1, and one side we have 3. So we now have the optimistic, the most likely, and the pessimistic. To calculate, we must calculate the expected time using the little formula. So notice when we have calculated it, sometimes it still resembles the most likely, but they are to be calculated. So notice that not everything remains the same. So you don't know which one will remain the same. So we expect that they will be calculated, right? And it is the expected time that you use as a display on the network. All right, so this is what you use for each activity. All right, I hope that's clear. If not, you take those questions to the tutorials. Okay, again, I must erase before we go on. No, and we're coming back to the variance. So just focus on the expected time for the moment, please. Then we'll come back to the variance, all right? All right, so let me just check that. All right, so having the expected time, you draw your network, follow the same precedence relationship that you had at the beginning. Because you have varying times for each activity. Now that we have varying times for each activity rather, what can happen therefore is that the expected completion time of 15 weeks can be expected to vary also, since we're not dead sure anymore about the time that each activity can take. It means we're not dead sure either that the project can be completed in 15 weeks. So a smart project manager then will give himself room by figuring out what is the probability that the project can be completed within a certain time frame. And you can't blame him because we just said that the time that we're assigning to each activity can vary. If the time that we're assigning to each activity can vary, it's only reasonable to expect him to think that, well, if the time that we assign to each activity can vary, it means that the calculated time that we had earlier of 15 can vary too. So the project manager don't want to be caught flat-footed and promise that, I can deliver this project in week 15 and week 15 come and no project. That's going to shatter the man's reputation. So he wants to have some more data to help him. No, sorry, to determine the probability of being able to complete the project within a certain time, we're going to have to look just a little bit on some information that you would have um, looked at in your statistics. Remember this little thing here? Yeah, I talked about the beta distribution. Because I said the beta distribution looks pretty much like the normal distribution. So we talk about the normal distribution. So this is the normal curve. We had calculated that the completion time of the project was 15 weeks. But because we have now given the activities varying times, we have to now say the completion time of the project is 15 weeks. We can't say, yes, it is 15 weeks. We have to insert the word expected. It tells us that there are probabilities lurking there, right? So we have to say, no, the expected completion time of the project is 15 weeks. So if it is that we're expecting the project to be completed in 15 weeks, it means it can maybe be completed in more or less than 15 weeks. Now, normally we ask you a specific question, which I'm going to ask you here. So I'm going to ask you then, what is the probability? So let me write it at the top. What is the probability of completing the project by week 16? Okay. I can ask you that because we're no longer sure that the project can be completed by week 15. Could be week 16 or 17. What's the probability that you can complete it by week 16? We expect it to be completed by week 15. But what if it goes over to another week? What's the probability? Right? So what do we do? Well, you remember when you were doing statistics that, let me clean the board from this side. So we're answering the question, what is the probability that we can complete the project by week 16? Yes. So what's the probability that we can complete the project by week 16? If the expected time for completing the project is week 15, then week 16 would be an additional week to the right. Week 16 rather would be an additional week to the right of week 15. So what we want to know is the probability that we can complete the project in less than or equal to 16, week 16, right? Now to do that, we're going to have to calculate the standard deviation of the project. To find the standard deviation of the project, because we're going to have to find what we call the Z values to enable us to find the area under the curve of being able to complete the project by week 16 or the requested week. It doesn't matter how many weeks, whatever the requested weeks are. So we need to find what we call the Z value to help us with that. But in order to find the Z value, we need to find the variance of the project. Why do we need to find the variance of the project? So we can find the standard deviation. Now, the variance of the project is computed by finding the variance of the critical activities. In some places, you will find them finding the variance of every activity in the project. Well, that really is not necessary because the project will rise or fall on the completion of the critical activities. So it's reasonable to use the variance of the critical activities to proxy the variance of the project. So we're going to just find the variance of the critical activities. Now, when we find the variance of each critical activity and sum the variance of those critical activities, then we can proxy the variance of the project, right? Now, sigma, which is that little animal there, sigma, is used to sigma square. So sigma square, sigma, the variance, and the square, you're finding the variance. The P simply means project. So the variance of the project, see it's written down below, is the sum of the variance of the activities on the critical path. Now the question is, how do I find the variance of the activity? That's now when you look at the last column that says variance. The variance of the activity is simply found by taking the pessimistic value, which is the B of the activity, subtracting the optimistic value, that's A, and dividing by 6 and then squaring everything, right? So it's B minus A over 6 and everything squared, all right? So for each activity, so let's take activity A, it would be 3 for the variance we're talking now, it would be 3 minus 1, which is 2, 2 divided by 6, and then you square all of that, you get 0.11, right? So if you look at, say, activity E, it would be 7 minus 1, which would be 6, 6 divided by 6, which would be 1, 1 squared is 1. Good. And so you do the similar move for each activity on the critical path. We just want the activities on the critical path, right? So though we did all though we calculated the variance for all the activities in the project, we are simply just needing it for the ones that are on the critical path. All right. So let's take a look at that. Again, I have to erase my page so I can go on. So here we have picked up the variance for each of the activity on the critical path. 0.1, 0.11, 1.78, 0.11. You sum that, you get 3.11. What do we do with that? We take the square root of the variance, and the square root of the variance gives us this standard deviation, right? So this is the 1.7 weeks is the standard deviation. So really we find the variance, and the variance that we use would be the variance of each activity on the critical path. We find those variance using the formula b minus a upon 6 all squared. We sum them. When we have found them, we take the square root. What does the square root of the variance give us? The square root of the variance give us the standard deviation. So it's sigma p, the standard deviation of the project, right? And in this instance, it is 1.76 weeks. So how do we use that? Well, let's go to the next page. So let me erase, then we go on to the next page, all right? Now, remember I said that even though we assume that the times follow the beta distribution, Hurt makes the assumption that the total project completion time follows a normal distribution, right? And that the activity times are statistically independent. So even though the beta distributions is a little bit looking different in the end, it seems to follow the information from the normal distribution can be used because of the assumption about the total project completion time. So the expected time would be the mean completion time of the project, right? And then you would have the requested time. So the 16 weeks is the requested time. What is the probability that the project can be completed by week 16? 16, there is the requested time. The mean of the project would be the calculated time, the time that you would have worked out on the network, all right? So then, to find the probability, we use that Z value formula that you would have learned in statistics when you're dealing with the normal table or the normal curve to enable you to find what a space under the normal table, what probability would be for that space that you're interested in. Now, so therefore, to find the probability for being able to complete the project within 16 weeks, you would employ that same Z value table that you would use in your statistics class. So if you don't remember, now is a good time to pause and get a little review of it. So the Z value here, we would often times write it in statistic as Z equals mu, sorry, x minus mu. Let me write that properly. So you would normally see the Z value formula be written as the x minus mu over sigma. That's how you would see the Z value written when you're in your statistics class, right? So it's the same formula we have borrowed here. So the due date would be the requested date, right? And that would be here, the due date. And the expected date would be the one you would have calculated on the network, right? And the sigma p, that's standard deviation, you would have found it from finding the variance and square rooting the variance. Good. All right. So erase that so you can see it clearer. So the due date would be the requested date of from the question. So that would be your 16 weeks, because I said, what is the probability that the project can be completed on or before week 16? The expected date would be the one that you worked out on your network, which was 15. Sigma p, which is the standard deviation of the project, you would have found that from finding the variance of each of the activity on the critical path, summing the variance of each of those activity on the critical path, and then square rooting that summed value. So when you have put them all together in this little expression, 16 weeks minus 15 weeks over 1.76, the result is the Z value, right? Where Z is the number of standard deviations, the due date, or the target date lies from the mean or expected date, okay? All right, so let me turn the page. So I'd shown you a visual of it already, but let me go back to the page. You know I have to erase it to turn the page, right? So here is your expected date. So the expected date is 15, and the requested date is, or the due date is 0.57 standard deviation from your mean or expected date. So the space that you're interested in is all that colored space, right? So you want to find the probability that you can complete the project over all that space. It could be less than the 15, you know, it could be 14 because you said on or before. So it's any time from 16 go down backwards to where I'm shading there. So what we want to find then is the probability. for that shaded space. So that 0.57, which is the number of standard deviation of the due date from the expected date, that will help us to figure out what the probability is. So this is not to erase every time I need to move. So back I go. So here you take your number of standard deviation that you've calculated, your 0.57, sorry, and you go to your Z value. Yep, same Z value table from statistic, right? And when you go to your Z value table, you look on the left, you see a column that says Z to your left. You pick out the tenths part, so this would be the 0.5, and you look along the top of the table. See, I just made that arrow the arrow rather going from left to right for the remainder, the hundreds or the thousands, and that would be 0.07. Come down to where they intersect. So there, that's written in white, that's shaded in white. So it's 0.71566. So we say that the probability that you're able to deliver the project on or before week 16 is 0.71566. If it's the 2 decimal places, then the probability is 0.72, or you have a 72% chance of delivering the project on or before week 16. Ah, now I know that was a lot, right? All right, so the project is expected to be completed in week 15, but there's a 71.57 chance that the equipment will be in place by the 16-week deadline, right? 5 activities are on the critical path. 3 are not on the critical path. So and of course the detailed schedule is available, the project schedule. So we look at the advantages of PERT and CPM. Here they are. I won't read them. I'll just have you to look at them. There they are, 4 advantages on this page. You have another 3 on this page. But you also, if you have advantages, you will have limitations, right? And so we have some advantages, limitations or disadvantages here of PERT, such as you must be specific with the precedence relationship. Otherwise you're going to be in trouble, right? So, and one of the limitation is that you may miss something in the project because you're so focused on the critical path of the project, right? Now I said that I was going to show you some screen grabs of how you can use Microsoft Project to help you to draw the project. So here I'm suggesting that you do a screen grab here, and you can use it as a learning tool. When you go into the labs in your learning time, you can go onto the computer and you can seek to draw a Gantt chart and seek to construct a project network. So here, making it bigger so you can see, you go to Microsoft project, and this is how you input the information, right? I'm gonna go to the next page. So when you use the Microsoft, you won't get all the little nitty-gritty that we're looking for. I will know if you use it because you to try and do the work for you. What you're doing is not to for it to do the work for you, but you're gonna try to see if you can use it to assist you. You can't just use the computer as a black box. You need to be able to explain what's going on in there, right? All right, so it's quite a lot, and I know the lecture is certainly more than 1 hour long, but I didn't want to split it up to do it in different places. Hence the reason why I pre-recorded this. So all the information can be found in one lecture. So I hope that whatever questions you have, you will take them to the tutorial. But that doesn't mean that if you have questions, you are not to attempt the tutorial sheet. You must attempt the tutorial sheet. It is imperative that you do that so that you can know where you stand in terms of your understanding of the material and that we can unravel the other pieces that you may have questions about in the tutorial. All right, so thank you for listening. And I hope that you will put what you have learned into practice. And if there are questions, tutors, we're always there to assist. All right, bye.